Salam and welcome. Thank you for joining me in another English reading of the Quran, translation and commentary by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, published by the Islamic Propagation Center International from Durban, South Africa. And we are busy with chapter number 12, part number 10. As we mentioned, we have completed the chapter 12 of the Quran. We are just reading the appendix with this magnificent story, the Sufi mystic story of Yusuf and Zulaykha. So now we see she made a very big mistake. She saw in her dream the Wazir of Egypt, but she saw the dream of Yusuf. But currently, the current Wazir of Egypt is an old man and a eunuch, right, whose private parts have been cut out. So she got a shock when she saw him, but nevertheless she went through with the wedding. But in fact, later on, the great Wazir becomes Yusuf. So her dream is actually true, right? So her dream is true, but it is a matter of timing. The timing was wrong. She waited in faith and longing. At length came news of a great sensation in the market. A foreign merchant was bringing, they said, a slave, the like of whom had never been seen, whether for looks or wit or integrity or purity of word and mind. It was no slave, but a sun of splendor, a moon of goodness, a king in the realm of love. The caravan had yet barely entered the city, but the king heard of it and ordered the Wazir, Zulaykha's nominal husband, to go and see and bring this new prodigy into the king's presence. When the Wazir came to the caravan and saw Yusuf, he found his beauty was even greater than rumor had described. He bowed down with feelings akin to worship. And this is very strange. Imagine the Wazir bowing down to a slave. But Yusuf gently raised him and taught him the gospel of unity, that there is only one God, that worship was due to God alone. When the merchant was told of the king's order, he pleaded delay on the ground that they were travel-stained and unfit to appear before the king until they had washed in the Nile River and made themselves presentable. Meanwhile, the fame of Yusuf's beauty, his goodness, his purity and truth spread like wildfire throughout Egypt. Each one man, remember, Egypt is in Africa, our continent, we are in South Africa. Egypt is in the northeast of Africa, along the Red Sea. Each one man or woman who possessed or thought he or she possessed any of these qualities, even in a minute degree, grew jealous that another, a stranger and a slave, should draw away all hearts. To the merchant, the value of his treasure went up the more it was talked about. The king might perhaps pay the whole revenue of Egypt to purchase him, but there was one to whom Yusuf's beauty was worth more than all the revenues of Egypt, and who could outbid the king himself. And this was Zulaykha. Absolutely amazing. She found the love of her life. She found the man of her dream, and now she's not going to let him go. So she said, I don't care. The king can come with all his money. I'm going to outbid the king at the auction sale, right? So this was Zulaykha, the lovely princess of the West, whose jewels were worth the revenues of 20 kingdoms. So she was a very fabulous rich princess, right? She had her father's money, so she didn't worry about the king of Egypt. She said, no, his money is nothing, my father is more rich, right? So this was Zulaykha, the lovely princess of the West, whose jewels were worth the revenues of 20 kingdoms, but who took no pleasure in them, in pining for the love of her dreams, who now stood in front of her. Absolutely amazing. She too heard of this wonderful prodigy and came to have a peep at it through the curtains of her litter. Behold, when she saw Yusuf, it was the very face she had seen in her dreams, for which she had left home and people and country, and for which she had been praying and pining these many years. She had no doubt about it whatsoever. She had found her love. Wow, what an amazing story. But to see is not to attain. The whole rabble saw Yusuf, and he was to be presented to the king. She told her husband in no uncertain terms to present a humble petition to the king. The king knew that he, the Wazir, had no son and could have none. Why? Because he was a eunuch. He could never have children. They had removed his private parts with castration. That means he was castrated. All his private parts were cut out, right? He had no spermatozoa. The king knew the services which he as wazir had rendered to the king, his dynasty and his country. Would the king permit him to bid for this wondrous slave with the wazir's own money? If so, the king would get the slave just the same, but would afford his wazir the happiness of having a wonderful son in his house to carry on his name. The king saw Yusuf and accorded the wazir the very reasonable request which he had made. Perhaps, though the poet does not say so, the king wondered whether the wazir would be able to put up the whole of the money, and may have intended benevolently to supplement the good wazir's resources should the need arise. This was the wonderful relationship between the king and the wazir. Then came a strange scene typical of Vanity Fair. Remember the novel Vanity Fair? Yusuf was put up to auction. Every petty individual thought he or she could purchase Yusuf. One old woman had nothing but a little yarn she had spun. So even the old woman were there to buy him. Absolutely amazing. Enough, she thought, to give me the honor of standing in the market. At least I can have a bid in the market, and boasting forever that I had bid for Yusuf. Imagine, she took a ball of yarn of cotton and she said, at least I was part of the auction. Some came from motives of curiosity, some from motives of jealousy. Why would the world go mad after a beauty or a virtue of a kind different from what they themselves possessed, however homely? And we know how hasad goes. People, when they see someone more beautiful than them, or more intelligent than them, or more handsome than them, then they always have hasad, right? Some came with pride of purse. 1,000 gold pieces, they shouted, as if to stifle all competition. The bid went on to 100 times as much. That means 100,000 gold pieces. Nor did it stop there. Of fragrant musk I will give to the full weight of Yusuf, said one who had traveled to the uttermost ends of the earth in search of costly, expensive perfumes. No good, said another. I offer the same weight of the most costly rubies and diamonds. Poor deluded mortals! The heaven's glorious sun was not to be deep searched with saucy looks. The wazir's resources, and indeed the kingdom's revenues, had been exceeded many times already in the bidding. But Zulaykha, the princess of the West, had untold wealth in her casket of gems. Yusuf was more than life itself to her. She bade the wazir double the highest bid. This was conclusive. Yusuf went to the wazir, and poor Zulaykha, she knew that Yusuf was worth more than the price she had paid for him. Yet in her feminine weakness, she thought Yusuf had a price. She thought that her beauty, her birth, her constancy, her unflinching gift of her person to him would weigh in the scale. Alas, even these things were not enough for Yusuf. The sale in the phenomenal world was all illusory in the real world. As Zulaykha had not yet learned this, she had yet to pass through many trials, temptations, sins and sorrows before her grosser self could be purged out and she could be fit to receive Yusuf. He was at a very high level compared to her spiritually, right? Meanwhile, he who could talk to the lowest in prison on equal terms was unattainable to Zulaykha. The dust of his feet had made the merchant who had looked after him fabulously wealthy, but Yusuf was still to be the prey to many prying glances, the mark of many poisoned arrows, the quarry of many cunning traps, but his soul was spotless and his manhood remained unsullied. Right, so join me in the next episode as we're continuing with part number 11, and we are busy with chapter 12, which is Surah Yusuf, stay well, look after yourself. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.